Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Conspiracy Farm, where we don't start the conspiracies, we just add the water. And now, your host of the most state-of-the-art, most informed podcast on the interweb, I present to you Pat Miletich and Jeffrey Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for...
We are locked and loaded, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be very exciting, a very information-packed episode. Wow, like I just told him, if I had $1 for every hour I've watched of his videos and been into his research, I'd be a very rich man. And as he said, if he had $1, he'd be a very rich man as well. This guy, wow. Professor Dr. Joseph Farrell. He is a professor of economics at Cal State Berkeley and has a PhD.
No. You've got the wrong Joseph Farrell there.
Holy crap.
I have no connection to California or being a professor of economics. That's a different guy.
Okay, well, let me rewind that then. Horrible show prep. You are the PhD philosophy guy from Oxford, correctly?
That's right, but
okay.
I am not a professor of economics.
Okay, rewind, folks. I apologize.
You screwed the pooch on that one.
Yeah. I apologize. He is a PhD from Oxford with a PhD in philosophy. He is an author of a great mini books, The Cosmic War, Babylon Bankers, Nazi International, the Giza Death Star. I mean, this guy, believe me, goes so very deep as a history guy. I mean, just very, very privileged and just stoked to have him on the show. Dr. Farrell, how are you today, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on, Jeffrey.
Absolutely. And I am, of course, joined by my co-host, partner in crime, UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich. How you doing today, Pat?
I'm doing great. I'm ready to get my mind blown. I mean, I've delved into a lot of different subjects, and to be honest with you, I have not spent a lot of time, not as much as you have. I've spent time on it, but I'm not near as deep into it. I'm not near as well read, so I'm ready to get my mind blown.
And it will do that very thing, sir. So, Dr. Farrell, let's just start with, we're going to begin with kind of World War II. Mm-hmm. And some of the machinations, some of the power that was going on prior to World War II. I guess we'll just start with this. The Germany lost the war, but not the Nazis. Talk about the climate, if you don't mind, leading up to World War II and the players involved, if you will.
Well, I'm assuming that what you're trying to get at there is the connections of the Nazis, particularly various leadership people within the Nazi Party, to the West.
Yes, your Bushes, your Tysons, etc.
Right. There's actually three things that you need to look at. You need to look at, number one, the connection between a German-American banker. His name was Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. So, if he's got German and American names. His parents had immigrated from Germany to this country, and then he himself immigrated back to Germany from the United States. He became the central banker in Germany in the interwar period. He was president of the Reichsbank during the hyperinflation period in Germany. He was the man that actually ended it. He put an end to all the currency speculation and everything that was driving the hyperinflation. He was by his own admission, he was the financial wizard. He was the chairman of the Reichsbank, the German central bank, all the way up to the very beginning of the Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler. So he's one fellow that you need to look at because he had very, very close, amicable, cordial friendships with the chairman of the Bank of England, a fellow by the name of Montague Norman, and then with the governor of the New York Federal Reserve, another friend of his by the name of Benjamin Strong. So the first guy you need to look at is Hjalmar Schacht, because he in turn is the man that had the idea and actually worked out the principal architecture of the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which became kind of the central bank to the central bankers. Mm-hmm. The BIS was used by the Nazis during World War II, not only to conduct some behind-the-scenes diplomacy. During World War II, the BIS was headed by an American president by the name of William McKittrick. And McKittrick, because of his association with the BIS has sovereign status. So he could travel all throughout Axis-occupied Europe under a diplomatic immunity. In other words, he was a kind of a go-between for the second group of people we need to look at in this regard, and that's what I call the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd.
Yes.
This group of American financiers and lawyers, including the Dulles brothers, of course, Allen and John Foster Dulles, come out of that law firm. Another fellow by the name of John McCloy.
John Foster Dulles, who wound up being Secretary of State. Allen Dulles, who wound up being head of the CIA. Very key players later on down the line in the Kennedy assassination.
Right, and then John J. McCloy, of course.
Former head of Chase Manhattan, part of the...
Well, let me get there.
Go for it.
Let me get there, please. Yes. A banker with Chase Manhattan, but he was also, prior to the war, he was the American consul for I.G. Farben in this country. And he shared a box with Adolf Hitler during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. In other words, this is how important this man was. After the war, he became the American High Commissioner for Germany, and in that capacity pardoned over 70,000 Nazis, many of whom end up in the first post-war West German Chancellor's cabinet, Konrad Adenauer. Then, of course, McCloy goes on to become a sitting member of the Warren Commission during the Kennedy assassination.
Along with Allen Dulles, whom was fired.
Along with Allen Dulles, yes. Let's make sure that we mention that. So you've got this association of the Sullivan and Cromwell people with the Bank of International Settlements that's kind of represented by the American president of the Bank of International Settlements during World War II, by the name of William McKittrick. It's out of that group that you see the American attempts to negotiate a peace with people inside of Nazi Germany all throughout the war, leading up to, in fact, in my opinion, the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler in July of 1944, July 20th, 1944, the whole Tom Cruise Valkyrie thing that we're familiar with. Well, there's a story behind that the movie doesn't get into, that, you know, there was contact with this German resistance ever since the outbreak of the war. In fact, it's that same group of people that was behind Rudolf Hess flying to England. So this group of people has this contact with an American peacenik party that wants to get the West out of the war so that Nazi Germany can fight the Soviet Union to the standstill. You know, Germany had it in 1944 about 60 to 80 divisions, if I recall correctly, on the Western Front. You know, that would have been an overwhelming force to move to the Eastern Front.
If I may ask real quick, is this the same crew that prior to all of this attempted to, in your speculation, attempted or did assassinate FDR and the whole Smedley-Butler coup? Is this the same kind of crew?
Yes, there are ties between the people, the Wall Street financiers that are behind the coup attempt against FDR early in his administration, his first administration. So yes, it's the same crowd.
Right.
You've got many of the same players involved, and it's all this nexus at that time with FDR. It's people around the DuPonts and so on, but you know, they certainly have their connections to that whole Wall Street, New York Eastern progressive establishment. So this is the second group that we need to look at. And then you mentioned, of course, the Bushes. The Bushes, Prescott Bush at that time, had the Union Bank and Trust, which was kind of a front bank for the Fritz Thyssen interests in this country. Fritz Thyssen was the German CEO of Vereinigte Stahlwerke, United Steel, inside of Germany. He was basically the head of an enormous steel cartel in Germany and a principal financier in Adolf Hitler's early 1930s campaigns. So in other words, you've got all of these financial connections between Germany and the West, with certain parties in Great Britain and certain parties in the USA.
Very, very crucial nexus there. Yeah, because I mean, as always, when you talk about war, it's always about economics or natural resources.
Right.
So, okay, yeah, and then this is obviously another conversation that I would like to have. The Nazis were involved in, to best of my can understand, they had access to I don't even, what would you like to call it? Secret technology, a technology that hadn't been kind of released yet. They were up to stuff during World War II. Is that correct? With specifically the Bell, as you call it.
Well, it's for me to answer that. What do you mean by access to? What is your thinking there?
Well, I'm not. I think Adolf Hitler, if I understand correctly, he had an understanding of. I don't know, could be wrong. Ancient histories.
Okay, I see.
A history which might have been hidden, and they might have had.
Well, the reason I asked that question that way back to you is I often get people who attempt to account for this massive burst of an explosion of technology that occurred during the 12 years of. I'm getting feedback here, guys.
Pat, you might have an echo on your end.
Okay. Anyway, I'm still getting feedback.
Pat, is that you?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better now. Thank you.
Okay. I have no idea why the volume jumped up on my microphone, so I apologize.
It was it was kind of confusing. Anyway, I have people ask me all the time when they attempt to account for this explosion of technology during the 12 years of the Third Reich's existence by leaping to crashed and retrieved UFOs and so on and so forth.
Exactly, yeah.
And I want to make it very clear. To me, this is a non-starter as a philosophical and epistemological argument. The temptation and the tendency within that community is to explain every human advance as somehow having been seeded by UFOs and contacts with aliens. And folks, I like to joke, but it raises a serious point that if every human advance is to be explained by crashed and retrieved UFOs, then pretty soon we're going to have to start crashing our stuff on ET's home planet so that they can catch back up with us. This is a non-starter of an argument. In my books, what I attempt to do is not to rely on whistleblower testimony or insider anonymous sources or any of this hogwash. I attempt to do actual speculative reconstruction of the chain of concepts within science and then the concepts within engineering to account for this explosion of technology. So with that epistemological qualifier in mind, then what I believe the Nazis did, why they were able to achieve such a stunning expansion of technology in such a short time, is because, number one, through companies like IG Farben, they had a vast network of interlocked licensing and patent usage agreements. So in other words, prior to the war, a lot of technology was transferred to Nazi Germany and incidentally from Nazi Germany by way of these gigantic corporations that were based in Germany that were concluding these patent swap agreements. All right. That's the first thing. The second thing is during the run-up to the war, the Nazi regime, and particularly the SS, began to create an infrastructure rather similar, in my opinion, to what you see in this country after the war with the establishment of ARPA, and then, of course, when it changed its name to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Mm-hmm. If you look at this agency, Jeffrey, you have basically a think tank who sit around dreaming up all sorts of fancy out of the box projects and then try to figure out the technology tree of how we get from here to there. Well, this is exactly what the Third Reich did. They set up a number of these outfits, the most prominent being an outfit that was under the control of an SS four-star general by the name of Dr. Hans Kammler. He was a doctor of engineering. And his group, what was called the Kammler Stab, was in effect a kind of very, very secret DARPA. And the mandate for this group was to literally think their way to second, third, and fourth generation weapons and the basic steps in the technology tree that would be needed to get there. And this is why I think you have this explosion of technology in the Third Reich, because they're thinking completely outside of the box. They are even, under Kammler, they're even freeing themselves from the constraints of adherence to Nazi Party ideology. So in other words, it's literally a free-for-all inside this little engineering think tank. It's not so little, actually. But that's my explanation for why you have this explosion and access to these sophisticated technologies. If you stop and think about it, by the end of World War II, the Germans either had operational or were ready to bring operational things like television-guided missiles, acoustic homing torpedoes, infrared heat-seeking missiles, chemical free tunable lasers, the whole panoply of things that we take for granted now were in prototype form by the end of World War II. So in other words, they're basically running prototypical versions of things that we now take for granted in warfare, smart bombs and so on and so forth. This was all achieved, in effect, by the end of World War II.
You even speculate toward, I think it was Barbarossa, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when the Nazis pushed into the Soviet Union, there was a certain battle or a certain couple weeks where the level of casualties was just off the scale. I think you even referred to it as like they liquidated them. What do you account for those mass casualties, and were they using experimental weaponry in World War II?
Well, actually, you're kind of jumbling a couple of things I've said in previous interviews, so let me kind of clarify. If you look at the casualties inflicted by the Wehrmacht on Soviet Russia in all of World War II, from June 22nd, 1945, up to the surrender on May 8th, if you look at all of this, the Wehrmacht inflicted about half the entire casualties of all of World War II on Soviet Russia. Now, any military analysis or any conventional military expert looking at this will tell you that that is a kill ratio, if I could be rather grisly about it, way out of proportion to any sort of conventional operations. All right? In other words, what they're saying is it's tactically impossible, as good as the Wehrmacht was and as tactically competent as the Wehrmacht was all throughout World War II, that kind of kill ratio is just, it's over the top. All right. So that's the first thing that we have to account for. There is something else going on the Eastern Front that really does not make sense. And this is compounded by the fact, and it's a little known fact, it really didn't register with Western historians of World War II, but in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians actually released their actual casualty figures, which were in excess even of the 25 million official figure that we have been told. Wow. So in other words, this was an unparalleled bloodbath, and it was an unparalleled large military campaign. We've never seen anything like this prior or since then in human military history. This was just unprecedented. Now, the other aspect of what you're talking about, I'm getting feedback again, guys, real bad. The other part of this that I think you were referring to in your question was the first part of the campaign from approximately June 22nd up to about the first or second week of August in Operation Barbarossa. If you look at the casualties that were inflicted on the Red Army in terms of prisoners taken, equipment captured or destroyed, formations rendered inoperable. You had, by the end of August, the Wehrmacht had liquidated about 60% of the initial operational strength of the Red Army and Air Force. Now, again, folks, that's just enormous. A lot of that was due to the fact that the Red Army itself was deployed in positions that were not defensive in nature. The other part of it is simply due to the speed and tactical brilliance of the German commanders during that campaign. But ultimately, we have to confront the fact that there was something else going on in the war, and this was hinted at by Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite SS commando. He was on the Eastern Front in 41 during the campaign, and he was part of the advance into Central Russia, and ultimately a part of the operational offensive against Moscow. During that campaign, it was called Operation Typhoon. During that campaign, the Germans were using something in their rocket artillery that appears to closely resemble a modern fuel air bomb. Okay? Now, if you don't know what a fuel air bomb is, it's the most powerful conventional explosive. You can make these things as big as tactical nukes. And apparently the Germans were using this, in their multiple barrel rocket artillery batteries at some point during the Battle of Moscow. So, think tactical nukes and carpet bombing in the same phrase here. Using this against the Russians. And it was so bad that the Russians sent word to the Nazis that, if you keep this up, we're going to have to resort to poison gas. And of course, Hitler didn't want that. So my point in raising that story is that they were using weaponry on the Eastern Front that today would qualify as weaponry of mass destruction. And this ultimately, in my opinion, Jeffrey, accounts for this enormous slaughter that you see in the scale of military operations on the Eastern Front.
It's very interesting. I wanted to ask you, Doctor, anything about, if you could educate the folks at home a little bit more about the education system that they brought over, the Illuminati, the folks from the Bavarian Illuminati groups, things like that I've read a little bit about. And was it Wilhelm Wundt that started, or that came to the United States and did some teaching?
No, Wilhelm Wundt never came to this country.
Okay.
What happened, I assume that you're talking about my book, Rotten to the Common Core.
Okay.
Yeah. I cover all of that in that book.
Because explain how this all leads up to the Common Core nightmare that I'm dealing with my children right now.
Well, read the book. It goes into this in a lot more detail. And folks, I have to, again, I'm not trying to make a plea, read my books. I'm making a plea that our primary source of detailed information is still books, not radio shows, not television shows, not documentaries, right, but books. But to summarize in a very quick fashion of what's in the book, Wilhelm Wundt was a German psychologist that decided in order to put psychology on a scientific footing, it had to be mathematizable. And in order for that to happen, we had to resort to a purely materialistic understanding of mankind. In other words, man is a machine. He's a stimulus response mechanism. And therefore, you see a direct line from Wilhelm Wundt to guess who? Pavlov and his dogs. Because Pavlov studied with Wundt, as did a whole host of American PhD students. The thing back then was, if you wanted to study anything scientific, well, you went to Germany. So you had a whole generation of American students that went over to Germany and studied with Wilhelm Wundt and absorbed this whole idea of mankind, and therefore, and this is also one of Wundt's theories about education, if mankind is a stimulus response mechanism, then education is really about designing suitable stimulus response experiences in the classroom. And with that, of course, I don't think it takes much imagination to see how you have turned from the handing down of a particular tradition in particular academic disciplines like mathematics or physics or what have you, to an emphasis on having a certain kind of experience in the classroom. Now, just to give you a brief overview of how many people were affected within the American Academy with these theories. Obviously, John Dewey was one of these people that were influenced by these ideas, but you can also think of Edward Thorndike, George Counts, and of course Counts had an enormous influence on so-called progressivist education in this country. And the other thing that this philosophy did, and here's the clincher, is by turning education from the handing down of a scholarly tradition of various disciplines, be it mathematics, rhetoric, literature, music, geometry, what have you. If you have a turn from that tradition to a idea of the classroom as a learning experience for stimulus response mechanisms, then what does the teacher become? The teacher becomes the psychological equivalent of a paralegal or of a nurse practitioner. Right. In other words, someone who has to be licensed, or in American parlance, certified, to apply these methodological principles in the classroom without having to be under the supervision of a PhD in psychology or an MD in psychiatry. So in other words, if you want a connection of why we see the drugging of American kids and the requirement that teachers have to go to some school and study something called education in order to get something called a certificate, which is simply a license to practice, that's why. It has led to the situation where someone like me, who has a PhD from the oldest university in the English-speaking world, cannot go to a public school and teach a class because I don't have that certificate. I'm not licensed to practice the psychology.
Right.
Wow.
So in other words, So in other words, this is why you see the psychological turn in American education. This is why you see, if I may be blunt, the butthurt snowflakes crying about their triggering and being offended at this or that thing on American college campuses.
We've seen it
because
all over.
They have been infected with this psychological concentration on the self, on having experiences and emotions and being authenticated and validated, rather than learning particular subjects. The system will not, and pardon me if I'm preaching here, the system will not be fixed by throwing any amount of money at it. It will only be fixed by ending the monopoly of this progressivist philosophy that has taken over and captured the American Academy via the mechanism of certification.
Right, wow. and then you take it to the next level after these people have been trained in school. Then you move on to the socialist government in control of people, basically the welfare state in America.
Well,
Hitler's National Socialism.
Look, once you have the idea that mankind is a stimulus response mechanism, in other words, the cosmology here is purely materialist. It's purely mechanistic. It is, to broaden the term, it's Marxist, because it's a purely materialistic thing that you're dealing with when you're dealing with mankind. All right. So yes, in that sense, yes. But the other thing you've got to remember is once you've said that, and once you have made education your laboratory in designing suitable stimulus response learning experiences, then what are you actually engaged in? You're actually engaged in social engineering.
Exactly.
Not education.
Right.
And this is what we point out in our book, Rotten to the Common Core. I had a co-author in the book that is actually in American education at this time. And, He's not alone. There are many teachers that know what the problem in the system is. It's just that no one can come right out and say, abolish the whole idea of teacher certification. Let old curmudgeons like me, that have a PhD and a traditional understanding of an approach to education get into the public education classrooms and teach. Because if the system goes on as it is now, eventually it's going to break down. People are going to start educating apart from the system, and eventually the system will collapse because everyone will see it for the fraud that it is.
Yes.
Hence the homeschooling, that's the massive wave of homeschooling that's going on.
Well, that's just the first stage of revolt. I think that ultimately down the line, you're going to see people and teachers just going back to the old system of private tutoring. In other words, there will be a system that emerges from this, and it will, because I'm quite frankly very skeptical of a lot of homeschooling. A lot of it tends to be very fundamentalist in nature, and that has its own dangers as far as I'm concerned. But I think homeschooling does, in that respect, represent the first stage of a revolt. But the next stage coming is actually a black market in teachers and tutors that will teach according to an old kind of traditional approach to academic learning.
And I almost feel like Trump put in our new Department of Education secretary in to almost wind that whole thing up.
Maybe so, maybe not. There's a whole school of philosophy that says everything questionable that Trump does is really him just playing 4D chess. I'm not in that school. I was a reluctant supporter of him. Certainly anything is better than Darth Hillary, but
and I'm a Rand Paul guy through and through.
Well, I'd be more inclined to support Rand Paul myself.
Right.
But she has her own skeletons in the closet. Certainly not
just a few.
Just a few, yes. But the whole Wundtian influence on American education that began in the 19th century, it's still there. You're dealing with generation 4 now, or 5, that's been raised in that kooky philosophy, and we see the results. We are turning into a banana republic with nukes.
Absolutely.
Because we have stupid people in the leadership class with smartphones and their hands on, the red button. So, not a good picture, folks.
Well, you guys, go ahead, Pat.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering how you tied Skull and Bones, the group of Skull and Bones, into all of this with the Illuminati and some of those folks.
I don't. This is why it's important to read my books. It's not that I'm not aware of Skull and Bones and all of this, but it's, the amount of material I've covered in 29 books is enormous, and I simply can't cover everything.
Yeah.
But Skull and Bones, if you look at it carefully, Skull and Bones is yet another one of these weird little German connections, because if you look at its own self-admitted history, it appears to have some sort of connection to a secret society. We don't really know what or where, dating back to about the late 1830s, early 1840s, somewhere inside of what we now call Germany. Well, if that's the case, then this would place the historical connection of the society to a time period in European history that is fraught with revolution all throughout Europe. Number one, the 1848 revolution is just around the corner. And if you look at the history, you mentioned the Illuminati earlier. If you look at the history of the Bavarian Illuminati after they were shut down in, I think, 83, 84, somewhere around there. May have been later than that, actually. But when they were finally shut down by the Bavarian government, well, what did Adam Weishaupt and his fellow Illuminati do? Well, they dispersed themselves.
Right.
Throughout Germany, all these little German states and principalities and duchies and so on. They dispersed themselves. throughout Germany. So, that was the very worst thing you could have done, is to disperse a group of radical nutcases like that. The only thing about Adam Weishaupt is you're dealing with Robespierre without a guillotine. This was the very worst thing that you could do. And I've always suspected that because of that dispersion and that unusual historical circumstance with the founding of Skull and Bones, that there may have been some sort of connection between Weishaupt and that organization in this country. Because you certainly see people coming out of Skull and Bones that appear to be scions of conservatism and so on and so forth, but they support the nuttiest ideas.
And the Bavarian Illuminati, I mean, they believed in destruction of religion and getting rid of the family and all those sort of things, didn't they?
Well, that's putting it in my far too simply for my taste. What they're really attempting to do is get back to what they understood as the primordial social, cultural, civilizational condition of mankind. In other words, they're trying to step back, so to speak, to some golden age in the mists of prehistory, where everything was hunky-dory, where there were no economic or class or racial or any other types of distinctions whatsoever. That's their ultimate goal. In other words, they're chasing after an early version of communism. But if you look at their actual writings, they come to perceive the distinctions of nobility and burgher and peasant and so on and so forth as contributing to the unhappiness of mankind as they understood it when compared to that supposed state of classlessness in the midst of prehistory. So in other words, they have constructed their own kind of secular religion. And ultimately, if you look at that religion, and this is why they're so against other kinds of religion, particularly Catholicism, but pretty much any kind of religion, Protestantism too. They do have in their doctrinal tenets, they do have this very weird kind of proto-Marxist feel to them. But it's all based on this idea that in some stage of prehistory, mankind didn't have all of these things that caused such division in society. That's their analysis.
And they felt that this was heroic as long as they were going to be the ones running it.
Exactly. Of course. They're the first attempt at a nomenclatura. All right. That's what they are.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
Wow. Blowing my mind. Well, I'm going to rewind us here back to, not that was just absolutely awesome. The end of World War II is kind of where we left off before we jumped ahead there. So much was going on at the end of World War II, and this is what I found so fascinating in your work. Obviously, you have, in the late 40s, you have obviously the end of the war, the beginning of the CIA, OSS, the beginning of the NSA, and you have, like I said, Germany lost the war, but the Nazis did not. Tell me about what happened to the Nazis via all of their subsidiary companies, IG Farben, all of them, all the gold, all the art, and how that money was leveraged over the decades into their subsidiary companies through the Bilderberg and Prince Bernhard.
I got the question. This is a very complex topic, and here's the problem. Let's deal with the Nazis not losing. That's not quite accurate enough. It's not so much that they didn't lose, because they obviously did lose. The question really is, in my books, I point out that there is no instrument of surrender to the Allied powers at the end of World War II that is signed by and for any representative of the Nazi Party. Okay? If you look at the surrenders of the German military, there's actually two different surrenders. One is by Colonel General Jodl, who is the chief of staff for the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, at Reims, France on May 7th, 1945. A day later, there's a second surrender ceremony that takes place in Berlin, with Field Marshal Keitel signing on behalf of the German army, then General Stumpf signing on behalf of the Luftwaffe, and then Admiral Friedeberg signing on behalf of the Kriegsmarine. All right. So in other words, you have basically all three service branches in the Berlin ceremony signing an instrument of unconditional surrender. But here's the problem. No one is signing it as a representative of or for the Third Reich itself as a state. Okay. And there is no one at either signing ceremony signing as a representative of and for the Nazi Party. Now, to me, Jeffrey, this has always struck me as extraordinarily odd, especially, and I do this in the book, The Nazi International. Please, folks, read the books. Don't try to understand this simply by listening to radio interviews. That won't work.
Nope.
The devil's in the details.
Yes.
If you compare the surrenders of Nazi Germany to the surrender of Imperial Japan, you'll notice quite a difference, because General MacArthur made awful darn sure when he drafted that surrender instrument that he was getting the Japanese to surrender everything by everybody. In other words, there were representatives empowered to sign on behalf of the Imperial Diet, on behalf of the Imperial Japanese General Staff, on behalf of the Japanese Navy, on behalf of the empire itself as the representative of the emperor. In other words, everybody is surrendering that needs to be surrendering, okay? But if you go to the surrenders in Europe, the only thing that's surrendering, apparently, is the German military. There's no representative of the Reich government, which at that time was Grand Admiral Dönitz. He doesn't have a representative there signing on behalf of him as president of the Reich. There is no one signing as a representative or agent of the Nazi Party, which the Allies were in a position at that point to demand that the Germans send somebody to represent the party to surrender and brand the party a criminal organization and order it out of existence. Okay? Mm-hmm. This is simply not done. You have to wait for the Allied treaties with West Germany after the war to see anything even coming close to this. So in other words, if you look at it from a purely legal point of view, you never have a legal, internationally recognized surrender of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party just goes on. It, in my opinion, it transfers itself elsewhere, which brings us to your second part of the question. What's going on with all of that loot? Okay. Because, everybody knows the Nazis were going around Europe, scouring Europe for enormous amounts of bullion, art treasures, liquid cash, and so on and so forth. And this is where it gets really very, very murky. You could spend volumes tracking this story down. I've barely skimmed the surface. Mm-hmm. What happens after Stalingrad is that certain leading Nazis, particularly Martin Bormann, begin actual strategic long-term planning to get as much of this Nazi loot out of Europe under corporate fronts and other mechanisms out of Europe. And by loot, please understand me, I'm not just talking about bullion or art treasures or stocks and bonds. I'm talking about patents. I'm talking about research personnel. I'm talking about security personnel. In other words, what Bormann is setting up is a post-war international extraterritorial state that is partly corporately connected and partly using its host countries to continue its existence as before.
Through companies like IG Farben, et cetera?
Yeah, through companies like IG Farben. But here's the killer. In Argentina alone, let me tell you a story. I always tell this story. In Argentina alone, American estimates were that the Nazis had smuggled out about $800 million. That's in 1945 dollars, folks.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. That was under the control, put that in quotation marks, of Colonel Juan Perón and his lovely wife, Evita. Okay, through the Evita Perón Foundation. This was all Nazi loot that they were laundering, all right? Now, let's look at the Bilderbergs for a moment, okay? Let's have some fun. Why do you think the Bilderbergers were founded? Well, it's so that Mr. Global can get together with his European counterparts and plot world domination, right? Okay. So let's look at who's setting up the Bilderbergers. Well, for the British, we have the Rothschilds. In the United States, we have the Rockefellers, Lawrence and David. But who's on the European side? Well, we all know Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, right?
Yes.
Well, who's Prince Bernhard? Well, Prince Bernhard is not Dutch, folks. He's actually German. He's a German nobleman. He's a prince that married into the Dutch royal house. And he was also a manager, kind of a middle echelon manager in, guess what? IG Farben. And one of the principal attendees at those early Bilderberger meetings was a fellow. He was there almost every year, a fellow by the name of Dr. Hermann Joseph Ops, who was the CEO of our good friends Deutsche Bank. Okay?
Yes.
During the war, Dr. Ops was the CEO of a small handling bank in Berlin that was the bank of accounts for the Reich government, which means that Dr. Ops was the guy who put his signature on the paychecks to Adolf Hitler for being Reichskanzler. Okay.
Wow.
So in other words, yeah, wow. What the Bilderbergers always looked to me, Patrick and Jeffrey, was this is a perfect mechanism that you want to set up if you want to move all of that Nazi loot from people who know where it is into the Western system of finance, keep it all off the books as a kind of a secret reserve, a hidden system of finance, and then move some of it back into Western Europe in the form of American aid under the Marshall Plan.
Oh, wow.
Incredible.
And let the bankers take their little cut along the way, you know. So in other words, yeah, this looks to me like the Bilderbergers were initially set up to coordinate the movement of all of this capital. Now, here's the clincher. If you think I'm whistling Dixie here, there was a CBS reporter by the name of Paul Manning that wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Paul Manning was a close personal friend of the CBS anchorman Ed Murrow, you know, the Cronkite before Cronkite, okay? And Manning wrote this book because his friend, Ladislas Farrago, had written a book called Aftermath, subtitled Martin Bormann and the Fourth Reich, documenting through Argentine Intelligentsia Central documents that Martin Bormann was alive and well and thriving in this big Nazi mafia, for want of a better expression, that was spread all over Latin America and pretty much everywhere else in the world. And, of course, the press savaged Farrago for this. And so Manning decided, well, he was going to go down there and get to the bottom of the story himself. So he writes this book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. He shows it prior to publication to another of his friends, Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA, who reads the manuscript and says, yeah, you're on the right track. Okay.
Wow.
Now, here's the fun part. In the book, Manning uncovers, and when I read this, you guys, my jaw, you have to just envision me sitting here in my library with my jaw on the floor saying, you're kidding, you know, to an empty room. Manning uncovered the fact that during the early 60s, a check was cashed, drawn on accounts at Manufacturers Hanover and Chase Bank in New York City. It was cleared by Deutsche Bank in Buenos Aires. And it was for a couple of $1 million, okay? And the check was written over Martin Bormann's own signature. Okay. Whoa.
Jeez, Lord.
Yeah, well, that kind of puts paid to the idea that he died, in Berlin over by the Lehrter Bridge. Or wait a minute, was it by that train station over there? Or was he in the tank with the Russians? Or no, was he if you read the story of Bormann's death, you've got 5 different versions, each from different eyewitnesses, just like the Nazi story of how Hitler died. And please note that, folks, we have to take the word of Nazis.
Right.
I don't know about you, Jeffrey, but if I own a life insurance policy on that one, I ain't paying it out until I have some better evidence, and not coming from a bunch of Nazis.
What a world. Wow. Well,
yeah, isn't it?
So for the sake of time, I mean, again, man, you can make this call if you want to come back. But for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of omit this part of, getting into Project Paperclip and getting into the Nazi ties to the Kennedy assassination, which is big. What I want you to touch on before I let you slide out of here, sir, so the political influence that this type of money has allowed over the decades, how has that translated to today? And we're looking at Germany kind of being the head of the EU. Is this the continuation of the Nazi plan? Is Angela Merkel a part of this?
Yeah.
And is this essentially what you call the Madrid Circular? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. I talk about the European Union in my book called The Third Way, a very important book. Folks, if you don't believe me, you've got to read this book, because the plans for the European Federation, these were actually war aims of Imperial Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II. Their war aims ultimately were to try to create a European federation. The Nazis elaborated, of course, like they would, in detail during the height of World War II. It was an IG Farben, naturally enough, Reichsbank study that was drawn up by various experts in Berlin. It was published in a book by the Reichsbank under the imprimatur of the then head of the Reichsbank, the German finance minister, Walter Funk. Again, that guy was tried at Nuremberg. But this book essentially was a collection of articles by different experts that were detailing how to set up a European federation that Nazi Germany could dominate. What you see in that blueprint is effectively what happened after World War II with the creation of the European coal and steel community, then the common market, then what was called the exchange rate mechanism, or the snake as it was sometimes nicknamed, and then finally the European Union, the Eurozone itself. If you look at that Nazi plan, and if you look especially at certain people behind it, you will see exactly more or less what's in existence today. You have a European Federation dominated, and I mean dominated, by Germany. One of the key fellows to look at here, if you're interested in pursuing this online, but again, I'm making a pitch for my book here, is a fellow by the name of Walter Hallstein, Hallstein. He was a lawyer, one of the Nazis' legal gurus prior to the war. It was Hallstein who came up with the idea of doing this via regulatory law. All right. After the war, interestingly enough, Hallstein becomes one of the key principal advisors to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, then Kurt Georg Kiesinger, Ludwig Erhard, all the way up to Willy Brandt. You see this fellow, Hallstein, lurking in the background, kind of as the eminence grise for post-war German chancellors of both major political parties. in Germany. So in other words, you've got a Nazi lawyer who becomes one of their principal advisors, and incidentally, one of the major co-signatories during that period of every single treaty that Germany is signing, creating all of these international European organizations, including, I might add, CERN. Okay, so yeah,
that's a whole other conversation there. I know you go
that's
deep
a whole
on CERN.
other conversation right there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So again, this is a part of it today. Is Angela Merkel is this is kind of an extension of kind of what you're talking about. The Madrid Circular, if you don't mind, that was published in I think 1950. That's essentially what this is, right? The European Union is the echo of the Madrid Circular.
The Madrid Circular is not so much about the European Union. The Madrid Circular is a geopolitical document outlining long-term strategy for this post-war extraterritorial Nazi state, as I like to call it, due to the outbreak of the Korean War. So that's why I didn't mention it in connection with the European Union. It certainly talks about a European federation as something that they want to do, but what's in that document is much, much more juicy and comprehensive than just the European Union. That's probably the subject for another day, because I see we're getting close to our close here. But it's an important document, in my opinion, even though there's no provenance to it. And that's what's so weird about all of this post-war Nazi stuff is you encounter these things and they have no provenance, but yet they were published at a time years ahead of the actual fulfillment, and so that tends to authenticate them.
That's what I find so fascinating. Go ahead, Pat.
No, I just wanted to fast forward to today's times. Is what's going on with Trump? Are these the same people cut from the same cloth that are trying to basically impeach Trump, trying to ruin him through the media apparatus and all the politics?
Well, let's put it this way. Very briefly, I think that they're not necessarily the same people, but they certainly have
descendants, so to speak.
Well, they certainly have similar concepts, but much more importantly, I think that they are liaised or networked with each other. So in other words, when you look at that neocon, neoliberal pustule in the American deep state, it certainly has connections with what I've been describing as this Nazi international or fascist mafia or whatever you wish to call it. But that fascist mafia certainly isn't the only deep player on the world stage. And right. Many people think that that's all I talk about, and that's my grand unified conspiracy theory. Well, it's not. There's lots of deep players, and I think that this just happens to be one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, the rabbit hole goes deep, man. With all of your work, I mean, again, if you would come on again sometime, there's so much more from Babylon to the Cosmic War to so much of the stuff you talked about. Literally, 60 minutes is not even scratching the surface of the surface. Can you put out any social networking? Where can we find some of your work?
You can go to my website, www.gizadeathstar.com. I do have a web store there that you can get all my books. They ultimately come from Amazon, but if you order off my website, I get a few extra pennies in royalties. And I blog every day there and have a members subscription area where we do other stuff. I talk about stuff I don't even talk about in my books. Anyway, I have Facebook. You can just look me up, Joseph Patrick Farrell on Facebook. Unfortunately, I think I've reached the limit of my allotted friends, but
do you have a fan page that people can follow?
A fan page. I think that's on Facebook called Giza Death Star.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, I am on Facebook. But the way to get
pump all of that.
Yeah, the way to get a hold of me is through my website. Just use the contact button.
GizaDeathStar.com. Wow,
Right.
Dr. Joseph Farrell, I cannot thank you so much for your time. Pat, do you have any final closing questions, statements for the doctor?
No, I enjoyed listening. Thank you for the education, Doctor.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, and we will hopefully get Dr. Farrell again on sometime. Thank you so much again, and tune in, folks, ladies and gentlemen. Stay tuned. There will be more.